At 6:14 on a quiet October morning, flashing police lights shattered the silence of a small American town where nothing unusual had happened for years. Detectives gathered around an abandoned farmhouse that had stood untouched for decades, following a single piece of evidence that everyone else had ignored. Hidden beneath weathered floorboards, investigators uncovered human remains believed to belong to a young woman who had disappeared almost 30 years earlier. Her family had spent decades waiting for answers. The town had long accepted that the case would never be solved. But one forgotten clue brought everything back to life. As investigators retraced the final hours before she vanished, they uncovered a disturbing possibility. The person responsible had never fled. He had never changed his identity. He had simply continued living among neighbors who greeted him every morning, attended community events with him, and trusted him without question. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy true crime documentaries and real mystery investigations, please take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. For nearly 3 decades, an entire town believed they knew the truth. But the truth had been buried beneath layers of silence, fear, and one person who was willing to kill to protect a secret. Inspired by real unsolved cases in the United States where advances in forensic science reopened investigations decades later, this story uses fictional names to protect the identities of those involved while reflecting the investigative techniques and challenges detectives faced. Now, let's go back to where this story really began. Nearly 30 years before detectives uncovered the remains beneath the abandoned farmhouse, Maple Creek, Colorado, was the kind of town people rarely left. Surrounded by rolling hills and quiet forests, it was a place where neighbors knew each other by name. Children rode their bicycles until sunset, and families gathered every summer for the Maple Harvest Festival. Front doors were often left unlocked, and a stranger passing through would almost always be greeted with a smile. Sheriff Michael Carter had spent most of his career believing Maple Creek was one of the safest communities in the state. His closest investigator, Detective Daniel Brooks, shared that confidence, convinced that serious violence belonged somewhere else. Among the town's familiar faces was Emily Harper, a kind 26-year-old whose warm personality made her impossible to ignore. She worked at a local bookstore on Main Street and dreamed of opening a children's reading center one day. Her closest friends, Sarah Collins, Olivia Bennett, Grace Mitchell, Jacob Turner, and Ethan Walker, were as much a part of her daily life as her own family, and together they represented the close-knit community everyone admired. Everything changed on a cold, rainy Thursday evening. Emily locked the bookstore just after closing time, waved goodbye to a customer, and stepped into the steady rain carrying a small umbrella. She called her mother to say she was on her way home and promised she would be there within 15 minutes. That phone call would be the last time anyone ever heard her voice. Emily never arrived home. As the hours passed, concern quickly turned into panic. Her family contacted Sheriff Michael Carter, who immediately asked Detective Daniel Brooks to begin searching for answers. Before sunrise, volunteers filled the streets of Maple Creek, believing they were looking for a missing neighbor who would soon be found. None of them could have imagined that Emily Harper's disappearance would become the town's darkest secret for nearly 30 years. The last confirmed moments of Emily Harper's life seemed painfully ordinary. After locking the bookstore for the evening, she stepped into the rain and began the short drive home through the quiet streets of Maple Creek. A few minutes later, she called her mother and said she was almost home. There was nothing unusual in her voice. She wasn't frightened, she wasn't in a hurry, and she gave no indication that anything was wrong. Then the call ended. 15 minutes passed, then 30. By midnight, Emily's family knew something had happened. Sheriff Michael Carter immediately contacted Detective Daniel Brooks, and together they began retracing every step of her journey, hoping to find a simple explanation before sunrise. Just after dawn, officers discovered Emily's car parked along a quiet country road less than 2 miles from the abandoned farmhouse that investigators would search nearly 30 years later. The engine was off, the doors were unlocked, and her purse, wallet, and keys were still inside. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no blood, and nothing to suggest why she would have left the vehicle. It looked as though she had simply vanished into the darkness. As news spread across Maple Creek, neighbors, friends, and volunteers joined the search. Jacob Turner, Sarah Collins, Ethan Walker, Olivia Bennett, and Grace Mitchell spent countless hours walking nearby fields and wooded trails, refusing to believe Emily could disappear without a trace. Days turned into weeks, and weeks became months. Search teams found nothing. Detectives identified no suspect. There was no body, no confession, and no answers. Slowly, hope began to fade, but Detective Daniel Brooks refused to close the file, convinced that somewhere inside the unanswered questions was the one clue that could expose the truth. As the investigation stretched on, the close-knit community of Maple Creek slowly began to change. Friendly conversations turned into whispers, and trust gave way to suspicion. Every unanswered question created another rumor. Detectives interviewed nearly everyone who had spoken to Emily Harper during her final days, including a local mechanic who claimed to have repaired her car just a week before she disappeared, Emily's former boyfriend who insisted they had ended their relationship on good terms, a respected businessman whose timeline contained several unexplained gaps, a former deputy who admitted driving along the same country road that rainy night, and a quiet farmer whose property bordered the area where Emily's car had been discovered. Each interview revealed something that demanded closer attention, yet none of it was enough to support an arrest. Every lead seemed to end just as investigators believed they were getting closer. For Detective Daniel Brooks, the lack of evidence was frustrating, but something else troubled him even more. Witnesses who had once sounded confident suddenly changed small details during later interviews. Times no longer matched. Conversations were remembered differently. People who had claimed they saw nothing now recalled strange vehicles or unfamiliar faces. Others stopped cooperating altogether. Sheriff Michael Carter believed fear had taken hold of the town, but Detective Daniel Brooks became convinced the changing stories pointed to something far more important. Someone in Maple Creek wasn't simply mistaken, they were protecting the truth. Years would pass before detectives understood why so many people had remained silent. But by then, the secret had already been buried for nearly 3 decades. Nearly 30 years after Emily Harper disappeared, the case was little more than a forgotten box of reports sitting in the Maple Creek Sheriff's Office. Many believed time had erased any chance of finding the truth. But when Detective Ryan Mitchell joined the department, he was drawn to the one investigation that had never left Detective Daniel Brooks' mind. Brooks, now retired, handed Ryan every file, every note, and every unanswered question, convinced the case still had something to reveal. Ryan spent weeks reviewing thousands of pages, determined to understand what everyone else had missed. Then he found an interview that had received almost no attention. A teenage newspaper delivery driver had reported seeing a pickup truck parked near the same country road where Emily Harper's car was later discovered. At the time, investigators believed the sighting meant nothing. As Ryan continued digging, 2 more overlooked pieces of evidence caught his attention. The first was a missing receipt from a small hardware store dated the afternoon Emily vanished. It had been logged as evidence, but was never fully investigated after disappearing from the case file. The second was an old photograph taken during Maple Creek's annual festival just days before Emily disappeared. In the background stood several familiar faces, including people detectives had interviewed years earlier. One detail in that photograph matched information from the forgotten witness, placing someone much closer to Emily than they had ever admitted. Ryan immediately shared his findings with Sheriff Michael Carter, who authorized a fresh investigation. That decision eventually led detectives to the abandoned farmhouse introduced at the beginning of this story, where one forgotten clue finally uncovered the truth that Maple Creek had hidden for nearly 30 years. With the forgotten witness, the missing receipt, and the old festival photograph finally connected, Detective Ryan Mitchell requested that several pieces of evidence collected decades earlier be examined using modern forensic technology. Tiny traces that investigators could not identify years before now revealed new information. The results pointed detectives toward the abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of Maple Creek, the same property that had quietly stood untouched for years. Working alongside Sheriff Michael Carter and with guidance from retired Detective Daniel Brooks, investigators obtained a search warrant and began a careful excavation around an old wooden shed behind the house. What they discovered beneath the weathered floorboards brought the entire investigation to a halt. Hidden below layers of soil were human remains that forensic experts later confirmed belonged to Emily Harper. Nearly 30 years after she vanished, her family finally had the answer they had been waiting for. The discovery sent shockwaves through Maple Creek. Residents who had spent years believing the mystery would never be solved watched as detectives returned to interview witnesses once again. The forensic evidence, combined with the forgotten clues Ryan Mitchell had uncovered, exposed critical inconsistencies in one person's statements over the years. That individual had remained in Maple Creek ever since Emily disappeared, living an ordinary life while attending local events, greeting neighbors, and avoiding suspicion. The mistake that finally unraveled the case was believing the passage of time would erase the truth. Instead, modern forensic science and one determined detective uncovered the evidence that had remained hidden beneath that old shed for nearly 3 decades, bringing investigators closer than ever to revealing who had taken Emily Harper's life. For nearly 3 decades, Maple Creek had carried the weight of a secret nobody wanted to face. After the discovery of Emily Harper's remains, the town that once believed it knew every neighbor, every family, and every story was forced to confront a painful reality. Someone among them had been hiding the truth. Detective Ryan Mitchell and his team began rebuilding the timeline of Emily's final night. Every interview, every old statement, and every piece of evidence was examined again. And slowly, the picture that had been hidden for years started becoming clear. People who once claimed they remembered nothing suddenly remembered small details. Conversations they had forgotten. Strange behavior they ignored. Moments they never thought were important. But now, every detail mattered. Several residents admitted they had their suspicions over the years. They remembered things that did not make sense. They noticed changes in certain people after Emily disappeared. But fear kept them quiet. Some worried about accusing the wrong person. Others believed the past should stay buried. And some simply convinced themselves that someone else would eventually find the truth. But nobody did. For years, silence protected the person responsible. Detective Ryan Mitchell discovered that the biggest mistake was not a single piece of evidence left behind. It was the belief that the truth would never return. As investigators connected the evidence, the story of Emily Harper's disappearance finally began to take shape. The night she vanished was no longer a mystery. The unanswered questions from 30 years earlier finally had answers. The person the town trusted had been hiding behind a normal life, while Emily's family waited all those years for a truth they feared might never come. For Maple Creek, the past had finally caught up with the present. And after 30 years of unanswered questions, one final chapter remained. Justice for Emily Harper. Part 8, 1830 to 2000 hours. Justice after 30 years. After nearly 30 years of unanswered questions, the people of Maple Creek finally heard the words they had been waiting for. The person responsible for Emily Harper's disappearance was arrested, ending a decades-long search for justice. For Emily's family, the news brought a complicated mix of emotions. There was relief knowing the truth had finally been uncovered, but there was also sadness knowing that so many years had passed without answers. They had spent decades wondering what happened, holding on to memories of Emily and hoping that one day someone would discover the truth. Now, they finally knew. The investigation that had once been considered impossible became one of the most shocking cases in Maple Creek's history. A town that had spent years believing the past was gone was reminded that secrets do not disappear just because time passes. The discovery changed everyone who lived there. Neighbors who had known each other for decades began looking back at moments they once ignored. Conversations they once dismissed suddenly carried new meaning. The case became a painful reminder that sometimes the biggest mysteries are not hidden in distant places. Sometimes they are hidden in familiar streets, behind ordinary doors, and among people everyone believes they know. Months later, the people of Maple Creek gathered to honor Emily Harper's life. A memorial was held in her name, bringing together friends, family, and residents who wanted to remember the person she was before her name became connected to a decades-old investigation. For the first time in nearly 30 years, Emily was no longer only a missing person in an unsolved case. She was remembered for her life, her kindness, and the people who loved her. The story of Maple Creek became a lesson that no secret stays hidden forever. Because time can delay the truth, fear can silence people, and lies can survive for years. But eventually, someone finds the missing piece. Someone asks the right question. Someone decides to look closer. And when that happens, even the deepest secrets have a way of coming to light. For almost 30 years, silence protected a killer. But the truth has a way of waiting patiently. No matter how deeply it's buried, eventually, someone starts digging. What do you think? Could something like this happen in a real small town? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this investigation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true crime stories every week.